Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Qizhi. Coming up in this edition, the Ukrainian president has met the US envoy in Kyiv, saying there is hope for a deal with Washington on investment and security. The South African president has announced the opening of the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting in Johannesburg, and displaced Palestinians in northern Gaza are returning to their homes only to find them reduced to rubble. We begin in Europe. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says his talks with the US envoy Keith Kellogg have restored hope for a deal with the United States. Zelensky expressed Ukraine's readiness to work quickly to produce a strong agreement on investment and security with the US.
General
Kellogg, our talks restore hope. We need strong agreements with America, agreements that will really work. I gave instructions to work fast and very much even-handedly. Economic interests and security interests should always go hand in hand, and the details of the agreement are important. The better the details are drafted, the better the result.
The Ukrainian leader also said his discussion with Kellogg focused on the battlefield situation, the security guarantees that Ukraine is seeking, and the return of prisoners of war. Stuart Smith reports from Kyiv.
Well, the last we heard from one of the spokespeople of Volodymyr Zelensky is that he was going into those talks with fighting spirit. Keith Kellogg, the US Special Envoy for Ukraine and Russia, having met the Foreign Minister, the Speaker of the Parliament here, and also other officials. But indeed, with that press conference cancelled, reportedly at the request of Washington, no news on what exactly they discussed or how it went. President Volodymyr Zelensky said that he was keen, of course, to put forward Kyiv's views, notably on the fact that Ukraine must be involved in any negotiations, and also that he believes that America must be involved in securing Ukraine's peace. Zelensky said that he'd spent many hours talking with top-level military officials, intelligence officials and senior members of his government in order to try to work out how to approach this and convince the United States to continue supporting Ukraine. The foreign minister afterwards has spoken about his meeting with Keith Kellogg, and he said during that meeting they tried to find ways towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace, and he said he reaffirmed Ukraine's willingness to achieve peace through strength. He reiterated, though, and this is the key point for Ukraine, that has to come through shared work with the United States, not even just with European countries.
That was Stuart Smith in the Ukrainian capital. Meanwhile, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte says that any European security guarantees for Ukraine would need to be backed up by the United States. The EU is scrambling to come up with a plan after recent negotiations between the US and Russia to end the conflict in Ukraine. Ross Cullen has more from Paris.
This landscape is changing the moment, not even by the day, often by the hour, in terms of the management of the discourse between Washington, Moscow, Brussels here in Paris, London, Kyiv, to try to understand the picture going forward, particularly led by the US. We've heard from the Secretary General of NATO. Speaking in the last hour, Mark Rutte said that, quote, "We should continue to strengthen Ukraine's hand. It will require robust security guarantees to reach an enduring peace in Ukraine," and that's also worth noting. It was one of the key parts of the statement released after Wednesday's second round of talks here in Paris between France and other Western allies, that they want to see a lasting, enduring peace in Ukraine. And I'll also just mention the fact that the G20 foreign ministers are meeting at the moment in South Africa. The French foreign minister there in attendance, Jean-Noël Barrot, and he has said that the picture that France painting and presenting at the G20 foreign ministers meeting is that they believe in a global order based on a rules-based order, a global order based on international law.
That was Ross Cullen in Paris. Turning to Africa, the South African president has announced the opening of the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting in Johannesburg. Cyril Ramaphosa called for multilateralism and the application of international law in resolving world crises. The meeting has put together top diplomats from some of the world's largest economies. Yolisen Jamila has details.
During his address at the first G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting under South Africa's presidency, Cyril Ramaphosa spelled out some of the world's biggest challenges and how they can only be resolved through unity and not division.
Geopolitical tensions and rising intolerance, conflict and war, climate change, pandemics and energy and food insecurity do threaten an already fragile global coexistence. These challenges are interconnected. They require responses that are inclusive and responses that should be well coordinated.
Ramaphosa further asserted that the G20 needs to renew its efforts to advance debt sustainability, with a particular emphasis on African countries, many of which are seeing their development being crippled by having to prioritize loan repayments.
We should take action to ensure debt sustainability for low-income countries. More than 3.3 billion people live in countries where interest payments of debt exceed the payments or expenditure that is made for education and health as well. The G20 needs to renew its efforts to advance debt sustainability with a particular emphasis, I would say, on African countries.
With Africa playing a greater role in global development than ever before, and with the AU now a full member of the G20, Ramaphosa said his priorities for South Africa's presidency wouldn't be just on debt sustainability, but also on other issues that African governments are concerned about, such as climate change and getting a fair deal for Africa's natural resources. Ministers and other high-level delegates are set to spend 2 days discussing a range of issues affecting the globe. South Africa said it was satisfied with the turnout, despite the American Secretary of State's decision not to attend over ongoing tensions with the host.
So we have a really good turnout in terms of the participation, and some of our key BRICS partners, for example, India is at ministerial level, Brazil as well. So, I think, from a G20 ministerial level participation, we are quite satisfied with that.
Meanwhile, Pretoria says it has duly noted U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's decision to skip the G20's finance ministers meeting scheduled to take place in Cape Town next week.
That was Yolis and Jamila reporting. At the G20 meeting, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi called for joint efforts to build a safer world. He said all nations must respect sovereignty and territorial integrity. Wang also said China firmly supports the African people in resolving their issues independently and believes that they have the wisdom, capability and right to manage their own affairs well. Turning to the Middle East, displaced Palestinians in northern Gaza are returning to their homes only to find them reduced to rubble. Nadra Al-Tibi has more from northern Gaza.
It's as if a massive earthquake had struck the Jabalia city in northern Gaza. Gone are the homes, shops and streets residents once knew, destroyed by Israeli bombs. What remains is only dust and rubble. Ambassador Telli returned after 15 months of agonizing displacement. She tells us about how the brutal war has torn apart her family and her home.
After my neighbor's house was bombed twice, my son, who works as a paramedic, made me leave my home. Even though I was determined to stay in Jabalia, we managed to get to the Red Crescent Hospital, but they did not have space for us. So we walked for over 3 kilometers until we reached the Mawasi area.
The UN estimates that due to the unprecedented scale of destruction caused by Israeli fire in Gaza, more than 90% of residences across the Strip have been damaged or destroyed, along with the widespread devastation of essential infrastructure. Basil is among the thousands who have lost their homes and are now living among the rubble.
After the ceasefire, I was told that my home in northern Gaza had been destroyed. I responded by saying that I would live in the rubble. However, when I reached my neighborhood, I could no longer recognize it. Even my son Aboud asked me where our house was. We walked and searched until we finally found our house.
Nearly 2 million Palestinians are enduring dire conditions due to the ongoing blockade, restrictions on humanitarian aid, and a severe water shortage caused by the destruction of water networks, with only 7% of water supply infrastructure still intact, according to international institutions. Winter has made the suffering of those in Gaza worse, as heavy rains bring damage to their makeshift shelters.
We were all living in a room, but it has been flooded because of the rain. Our clothes and blankets got wet, so I have been trying to dry them in the sun. It is cold here, and all that is left of our house are these stones, but this is our last shelter.
Louis Wateridge, the spokesperson for the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, or UNRWA, described the situation in the Gaza Strip as worse than ever.
That was Nadra Al-Tibi reporting. And finally, US President Donald Trump's tariff threats are looming large over Asia, home to some of the largest suppliers to the US steel, aluminum and semiconductor sectors. Zhu Bing from the Chinese Commerce Ministry says the US move violates World Trade Organization rules and threatens economic cooperation.
The US imposition of additional tariffs severely violates World Trade Organization rules. Not only does it fail to address its own issues, but it also undermines normal economic and trade cooperation between China and the US. This move is detrimental to the development of foreign invested enterprises in China, including American-funded companies, and disrupts the investment decisions of multinational corporations.
Other Asian countries have also voiced concerns for the US tariff move. Japan has asked Washington to exclude it from steel and aluminum tariffs, with the Japanese trade minister reportedly planning to visit the US in March. South Korea has announced that it is seeking high-level talks on the issue. Shingham reports.
We heard the acting president calling on officials to have more stronger outreach and actively engage with U.S. officials to try and get exemptions from the U.S. tariff plan. We know this week that the deputy trade minister is in Washington to meet with officials there, and he has filed a formal request with the U.S. Commerce Department as well as the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to seek South Korean exemption, citing the fact that South Korean businesses already actively engage and contribute to the U.S. economy with investments, and also the fact that in a unique situation, Seoul and Washington currently have a free trade agreement that's been in effect for over a decade. To remind the fact that back in 2018, President Trump actually signed a renegotiation to that free trade agreement, specifically abolishing tariffs on steel exports to the U.S. and instead using a quota system on tariffs or steel that goes to the U.S. and also the fact that South Korea will import more autos from the U.S. But in terms of the actual tariff rate that South Korea pays on U.S. goods right now, the average tariff rate is essentially zero at about 0.79%. So those are some negotiation leverage points. But as far as autos and semiconductors are concerned, semiconductors are South Korea's #1 export to the United States. Autos, South Korea is a #2 exporter of cars to the U.S. after Mexico. So any sort of additional tariffs on South Korea would be very disruptive for the country. In fact, one report shows that a 25% tariff rate on South Korean autos would affect exports by about 20% at this point. So obviously, there is some time for negotiation. And what other sort of leverage points that officials here may have, South Korea could concede more energy in the energy sector, importing more U.S. energy goods. And also in terms of shipbuilding. Shipbuilding is another area that President Trump has pointed South Korea. There could be cooperation. But until we get more details, the exact effect on South Korea's economy, whether direct or indirect, remains to be seen.
That was Shingham reporting. Now recapping the headlines, the Ukrainian president has met the US envoy in Kyiv, saying there is hope for a deal with the US on investment and security. The South African president has announced the opening of the G20 Foreign Ministers Meeting in Johannesburg, calling for multilateralism. And displaced Palestinians in northern Gaza are returning to their homes only to find them reduced to rubble. And that's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a one-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Xizhi. Thanks for listening.